Welcome to the Managing Violence podcast, where we talk all things self-defense, violence prevention, and aggression management. My name is Joe Saunders. I'm your host. Let's go. Good afternoon / morning / evening, wherever you are. Welcome to another episode of the Managing Violence podcast. Joe Saunders here with you, and we have another returning guest this week. One of my favourites, a guy I always enjoy bantering with, Mr. Gershon Ben Keren. Gershon is a Krav Maga instructor, also a profound academic, an author, has master's degrees in psychology, working on another master's degree in criminal forensic psychology. Really interesting guy, very well spoken, has walked the talk and also studied the talk and been there, done that when it comes to pretty much anything in violence management. So definitely a guy worth listening to. We are talking this week about workplace violence, in particular type 2 workplace violence, which is customer initiated or customer on staff aggression and violence. So that's the topic for this week. If that's your bag, you're going to enjoy this conversation. Also, if you're a regular follower of the podcast, you'll notice that this is episode 9 of season 2. Season 1 was 10 episodes. Season 2 will also be 10 episodes. That means this is the second last episode of the season. Don't be too sad. We are going out with a bang. Next week, we have the one and only Tony Blauer, one of the real founding fathers of reality-based self-defense. One of the first guys to really incorporate behavioral, emotional, and psychological aspects into self-defense training, and I've just recorded the podcast with Tony, and it is a ripper. It's up there with the Matt Larson episode from season 1 as possibly one of my favorites, and also along with this episode, I really enjoyed listening back to this one with Gershon as I've done the edit today. So season 2, episode 10 next week will be Tony Blauer. Make sure you don't miss that. Season 3 won't be far away. We're not going to be taking a big break. I've got interviews already scheduled for season 3, so that won't be too far away. I will have an announcement for the exact date that season 3 episode 1 will be out, and I'll hopefully be able to announce that in time for next week's show. And during the break, I intend to upload a bunch of content to YouTube, so make sure you follow our YouTube channel if you want to get announcements and updates regarding the show. And of course, don't forget, we are now on Patreon at patreon.com/managing violence. If you'd like to chip in and help us continue to improve the show, better guests, no ads, better sound quality, all that kind of stuff. Unfortunately, a lot of it costs money. And at the moment, this show doesn't make any money. So if you'd like to be part of fixing that and making sure I can continue pushing on with this at the expense of my paid employment, then please head over to patreon.com/managing violence. Also, please check out our social medias. We are on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, Twitter, LinkedIn. We're on pretty much all of them, either as Managing Violence or Joe Saunders. Check me out. Feel free to add me. I'm always happy to interact and hang out. All right. Last thing before I jump into the episode, we are doing a big push on reviews at the moment. If you could go to iTunes or wherever it is you get your podcast, leave us a 5-star review with a few words, screenshot it, send it to joe@joesaunders.com.au, and I will reward you with a PDF of my first Bouncer Stories mini book, which is about to be rewritten, but I will send you the first version free in your inbox. All you've got to do is write a 5-star review and send me the screenshot to my email. That's it. Now that that's out of the way, let's jump straight into my interview with Gershon Ben Keren. All right, Gershon, thanks for joining me back on the podcast, mate. It's been a great pleasure to have you a second time. The first episode was very well received, and probably one of the first episodes that really took off. So I'm very happy to have you back again, and let's have a bit of a chat. But first things first, for those that haven't listened to the first episode or maybe don't know about you, can you give us sort of a 2-minute blurb of who you are and what you do and what your journeys look like to get to where you are?
Okay, so I'll sort of start where I am now. I run a Krav Maga studio in Boston, Massachusetts. It's a 16,000 square foot training facility. We train civilians, law enforcement, military personnel. That's one side of my business. The other is in terms of consultancy and training to corporate clients. So that involves a lot of healthcare because Boston's a big hospital city. also in the finance sector, so risk management mitigation, and all sorts of training from front of house staff to security individuals in terms of conflict resolution, de-escalation, and all those good things.
Right, awesome. So, yeah, that's it in a nutshell. And just for those that might be more academically minded, do you just want to run through quickly your academic qualifications as well?
Yeah, I've always been involved in the research arena. I have a master's degree in psychology, and I'm just at the moment finishing up with a thesis for my criminology and criminal psychology masters. So one of the things that I've always tried to do is stay abreast of the academic findings within the security industry and its sort of related areas such as violence and aggression, and bring that academic learning and theory into the sort of practical world.
Yeah, awesome. All right, well, that's a good snapshot. Also, throw in that Gershon's a prolific author. He's written a number of books on Krav Maga, and they're certainly worth checking out because it's not your typical paint by numbers or instructional Krav Maga books. They're, to me, I mean, the techniques are beautiful, and the photography rather is exceptional because it's all taken place in real environments rather than in a sterile studio setting, which is really cool. But to me, the things I really loved about those books was the writing around it and the topics that were discussed around it, which was I think is the missing part in a lot of martial arts and self-defense books is the context. So I highly recommend you check out Gershon's books. And also, he's also got a ton of practical experience as well from working the doors and for being hands on probably a few too many times over the years, as most of us can attest to.
Yes.
So, right. So the topic that we sort of flagged, it was maybe a month or more ago when we first started talking about doing another show, was workplace violence. It's something that is a particular interest for me at the moment. Well, it has been for many years, but at the moment we're in the middle of actually writing up a academic research project.
Very good.
Yeah, so that's that was my idea, and it's somehow become all my job, which was not my intention when I pitched the idea to Gav. But my intention was the guy with the PhD would do the work, and unfortunately I was a little bit naive about how that would happen.
Oh, no. They're the guy at the top. They'll tell you what to do.
Yeah, pretty much. So he'll have a laugh when he hears that. But we're in the process of doing a research project to identify the context of workplace violence in Australia and establishing a best practice model for the management of that and how that relates to duty of care, etc. So it's been a topic that has been it's been sort of front of mind for me for a little while, and I know you've done some work in that space. So I thought maybe we could explore it, and also the context is a little bit different with the US, being that you're transplanted but now based in the US, and workplace violence does have different connotations in America than what it does in other parts of the world.
But and a lot of similarities as well.
For sure.
It's one of the things when you first said, let's have a look at workplace violence, I was like, wow, it's such a broad landscape, from troubled employees and workplace bullying, right through to things that people don't often think about, such as people crossing picket lines to get to work during a general strike of some nature. So it's one of those areas which is, potentially massive. And so I was always, when we had the sort of conversation a few days ago about what area should we be looking at, because obviously we can go right down into the active shooter, active killer realm, right through to Ted Kaczynski kind of Unabomber scenarios. All of that falls under workplace violence. So obviously it's a very, a huge domain to look at.
Yeah, it sure is, and I think probably to establish a context up front for anyone who might be clicking on this episode because they see workplace violence, our focus for this particular chat is going to at least start off with with what's referred to as type 2
Yeah,
workplace violence being customer aggression. So
yeah,
if you're after an episode about active shooter training or hostile employees or HR practices for not hiring
yeah.
sociopaths or anything like that, we might cover that in the future. It may come up a little bit organically, but this is going to focus primarily on customer initiated aggression towards employees. So I just want to establish that context early, so no one's disappointed waiting for something that we may not get to. That said, I'd still, given recent events, it would still be good to touch on the active shooter threat as well.
I think it may come up like naturally, as you say.
Yeah, and I think it's important that we establish that workplace violence and even customer initiated violence or customer on staff violence, it can be a full spectrum. It can be everything from aggressive comments, it can
Yes,
be threats, it can be telephone threats, it can be even just bullying in terms of making complaints about particular staff
yes.
members to try and affect their employment, and it couldn't go all the way up to physical violence and as we said, active shooters and mass casualties. So I think there's principles we need to address, cover off on, but
Yeah.
I think there's plenty of spectrum still, even within that one
Oh,
subset of
yes,
workplace violence.
definitely.
So, mate, let's just start off. What are sort of the things that you think about when you get a job as a consultant in the workplace violence sector? They've got an issue with customer aggression. What's some of the general advice or general things you start to look for?
Um, well, one of the areas that we sort of work in here in Boston is in the healthcare sector, which certainly in the US is one of the sort of big industries for customer facing violence. So I think there was a 2014 report that stated that 94% of all aggravated assaults by type 2 were committed in the healthcare industry. So part of what you're looking at is the industry context. So who are the company's clients going to be? Because obviously a patient or a relative of a patient is going to have different concerns to let's say shop staff who are dealing with customers who are returning faulty goods. So the first thing I'm always looking at is who are the clients, who are the customers. So defining the context right out of the box. So, like I say, a relative of a patient, let's say it's their mother, whose treatment isn't going so well, is going to have a different type of aggression and a potential for violence than somebody returning a faulty piece of electronics to a shop after Christmas. So there's that, and also just mentioning that, also the time, because in different industries, different times of year have different threat levels. So, for example, if you look at the US, where we have after Thanksgiving, Black Friday, one of the dangers there is like mobs of highly motivated customers looking for bargains. And you'll often see news reports of kind of the Walmart doors being smashed open, as a heavy mob like pushes up against them. So part of it as well
That's
is
crazy, isn't it? That
it is.
so just to interrupt you, you think about at what time in human history have we had mass outbreaks of violence based on commercial interest? I mean, like what an unusual situation we've actually created for ourselves. We've actually,
Yes.
through offering discounts and bargains, we've actually created the possibility of mass casualties.
It is quite. I mean, it's one of those things that I shake my head, I laugh at, and get depressed at all at the same time. Um, but I mean, it really is a very serious time of year from a safety perspective. If you're an employee in one of those establishments who might be called upon between two kind of parties to decide who is the rightful owner, of a $20 pair of jeans that both parties are holding on to, and be that ultimate decision maker. So there's
Yeah,
some
that's a
almost
really interesting risk. That you've got you're a 17-year-old store clerk who's going to be potentially putting their life on the line if they choose the wrong person. It's
Yeah,
actually something I've never even considered in that context. Yeah, it's funny. Black Friday here has a different risk because, in a general risk management point of view, you actually end up with employees that take the day off work so they can spend the whole day online shopping and
right.
taking advantage of US retailers. So, it's, uh, although there's more and more Australian businesses that have actually started doing Black Friday sales to match the US, even though it
Yeah,
has the date has absolutely zero relevance to our to our tax cycle or anything else. It's just sort of they
yeah.
pick the date and gone, well, if it's a thing, if people are shopping online, they might shop in stores. So, yeah,
It's
it's
a
really
global
interesting.
economy,
Mm,
you know.
mm.
But yeah, it's I think the two things I first look at is the context and the client base, and then looking really at the life cycle. Um, so is there a seasonality to the industry, or is it kind of flat? And there are different times of year again where in the hospitals where there's a lot of how do you put it, over demand is times, for example, in Boston when it snows and gets icy. So that tends to be a time when emergency rooms start to fill up. Certain holidays like July the 4th, over drinking, emergency rooms start to fill up. So you can sort of sometimes in certain industries see a calendar when there's high risk times and what might be the particular risks in those times.
Yeah, I think that's really important to understand as well. Is even something as simple as during a heat wave, you typically get more violence.
Yes.
People are typically more angsty, and especially if you are in a public gathering location. Let's say you're in a shopping center. Uh, at least here, and I assume it's the same in the US as well, where when there's a heat wave, people flock to places that have mass AC. So
Correct.
you're going to end up with more people in shopping centers, more people at public recreation venues, more people going to cinemas, things like that. So it's
And 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 the AC is an interesting one because if you think about the from a sort of social demographic point of view, the people who are likely to be having AC in their home um, are middle class families, individuals earning a decent wage, and the people. And again, I'm not trying to be classist here in any way, but those individuals on lower incomes, and I'm not saying everybody on a low income is obviously a criminal, but lower income classes tend to hold criminal classes amongst them. You're bringing those people who don't have an AC out into the public where they do. So you can end up with a disproportionate number of criminals within a location such as a shopping mall. I hope
yeah,
that
really
doesn't
good
sound
point.
too much like I'm making a sort of like, oh, poor people, we shouldn't be allowing them out during the heat wave. Um, but
Yeah.
there is that tendency, where you have sort of lower socioeconomic criminal classes moving into those areas at those times, and also changing often their behavioral patterns around that when they are active, which tends to be later at night when it's cooler and those type of things. So again, just looking at heatwave and the types of businesses that might be affected, you might suddenly have a lot more people out at later night type establishments when it's a little bit cooler, which is then going to put increased demand upon the services and products that they offer. So, the line waiting for, fast food might now be twice as long as it was before. So those are type of things. I mean, they're kind of very specific things, but just as we're talking about heat waves, how that can affect businesses.
Yeah, and just one last point on that. I mean, I don't want to make a podcast about heat waves, but uh, many years ago, I was managing the security for a shopping center, and it was quite an old shopping center that had kind of ancient infrastructure. It just really had never had the budget for the refurb it desperately required, and it was also in a very low socioeconomic area. I used to refer to it as an open air prison
Yep.
because there was two major prisons really close by to the shopping center, and most of the people that lived in that particular area well, I won't say most, but a large percentage of the people that lived in
Yeah.
that particular area were there because a relative was in jail, and
Right.
it was a convenient place to live and still be able to visit them. So, yeah,
Right.
great place to work. At a context, the first 3 weeks that I was there, I made more emergency phone calls, AAA phone calls for Australia, the 911 equivalent. I
Yeah.
made more emergency phone calls in that 3 weeks than I had in 15 years of security prior. It was it was incredible the amount of violence and overdoses and so on that we had in that particular shopping center. But the one of the worst particular weekends I remember was the weekend our AC died, and all of a
Oh,
sudden everybody's in there and they're overheating and
yeah.
just everybody's at each other's throats, and it's funny. It's like people didn't realize or didn't occur to them to just go home. They just stayed at the shopping center and bitched and moaned about how hot it was. So
The
yeah,
creatures of habit.
really interesting, huh? It's
Yeah.
yeah. So obviously the context is super important. Healthcare is a very unique animal in that regard. I often say that no one's in an emergency department at 3 a.m. having a good time.
No.
Uh, and even just from a phone-based point of view, if you're having to call a relative saying, "Hey, your relative is in the hospital," no one's arriving in a good headspace by the time they get there.
No.
It's they're already stressed, they're already on edge, and one thing that I like to look at in that space too is it's not just the client or it's not just the customer who is on edge. It's the staff member, especially in
Oh,
healthcare.
absolutely.
Here, I mean, if you're a nurse pulling a double shift and you're 14 hours deep into your shift, and you're fatigued and you're hungry and you've already been dealing with difficult clients for the past however many hours, you're probably not responding to that heightened level of agitation very well yourself. So
And,
there's
and
so
I
many
think
different risk factors.
and I think that's where you touch on an organizational point there. Does it have to be the person who might have been dealing, 14 hours with injured people who needed care, actually being the interface with the relatives? Would it be better to have somebody who's, permanently refreshed and whose sole job is to be that interface dealing with communicating a patient's needs to those who came in with them, rather than the person who, during that conversation, may be wanting to get back to actually treat them. So I think sometimes organizations can sort of combine roles inadvertently. I'm not saying it should definitely not be the nurse or the doctor who's treating the person communicating with the relatives, but it might be better if there's somebody who's better trained, possibly in that communications regard, and who can manage and be that one kind of port of call. Because I know when I've taken people in to emergency rooms before, and often you're ending up getting passed from one doctor to another as that person goes through the process. So sometimes having that central hub of communication can be one way to avoid some of those issues.
Yeah, I think one of the models that I tend to recommend in this space is having a triage system and even taking it outside of healthcare, which obviously triage means a certain thing,
Yeah,
but having a particular staff member whose job is to essentially greet and identify what particular needs that person
yeah,
has, whether that be emotional needs, physical needs, whatever. But having essentially a screener who can then flag for whoever is going to be offering the service or the treatment that they've come into the business for. Um, Look, just to give you a heads up, they're a bit agitated,
yeah,
possibly intoxicated, exhibiting these signs of mental illness, whatever it might be. But at least then the treatment team or the service team that's going to be receiving that client has a heads up and they can mentally prepare to be a little bit more aware or they can be a little bit more tolerant or whatever
right,
situation might be. But to your point, having a triage person whose job is just to read the situation, not take it on board, not deal with it, just kind of read it, take some
yeah,
notes, and then pass it on, and then be a central point of contact without actually being the face of the problem as such. I
yes,
think it's sometimes very useful, and I recommend that in service environments as well, where you have someone who's just screening your line and having conversations, and then saying, "Look, yeah, FYI, when this person gets to the counter, just be aware of this particular behavior or this particular mindset.
And I think that's one of the things, again, with a lot of people when they're performing a job, they're certainly initially experience might give them another sort of viewpoint on it. But certainly initially, they're trying to do the job. And if that job is trying to save a patient's life, that's what they'll be trying to do. Everything else around it is kind of secondary to them, as it should be. But the problem then is when that person is called out to fulfill another kind of responsibility, which is to compassionately communicate what's happening. And you might be fantastic at one part of the job, but not actually a skilled communicator. So sometimes, like you say, somebody who's working a 14-hour shift may come across as a bit abrupt. And so it's making that decision, do I want all of my staff to be well-rounded, or am I going to recognize that some people aren't actually natural communicators, and that kind of role and responsibility should be passed on to somebody else?
Yeah, actually, my wife got really into it's a US show, The Good Doctor, I think it was, with the autistic doctor. Really interesting TV show, but yeah, basically it illustrated just that point. You had a central character who was a brilliant problem solver and brilliant doctor, but just lacked social skills. And the whole I guess the whole tension of the show is his inability to communicate, even though he's brilliant. So it's a compelling watch if anyone's interested in doing that. So just moving on from that point. Let's talk a little bit about verbal aggression, taking it out of healthcare, because healthcare is fairly unique. For retail or service-based environments where you have staff that are, let's say that they're not professionals, in that they're not degree qualified, or they're not they're working in a front-facing service role. Where they possibly haven't had a lot of training in how to actually do that job. I mean, what's the training for most retail positions? Maybe a day in class, and then a week being shadowed, and then you're on your own. So they certainly haven't had advanced customer aggression training. They certainly haven't had verbal de-escalation training. They certainly haven't had self-defense training. And then they're put into an environment where they might be dealing with people that are agitated and angry. So if you're let's just take retail as an example, just to keep it sort of focused. What sort of training or what sort of services would you sort of be looking at to try and help a retail organization prepare their staff, given that their staff are quite often transient? They're not going to hang around for more than 6 months or 12 months or whatever, and training budgets may be limited.
We teach a very short 60-minute de-escalation and conflict resolution seminar, really for that purpose, that you're not going to want to put somebody through a whole day of training. And I can go into more detail on it, but basically a lot of it revolves around asking open-ended questions. So saying things like, what can I do to sort this out? So letting that person, that individual who might have some complaint or be aggressive, start to actually think about various alternatives which might be open to them, other than acting aggressively. And it also gives that kind of idea of empowering the customer. It doesn't necessarily mean that the person is going to, agree with everything that they do, but really that use of open-ended questions. So putting it into the customer's hands of, okay, what would be the resolution for you? Because that way you can actually find out what the person is trying to achieve. And that's sometimes very difficult in high stress situations. And it may be that the person coming to that situation isn't quite sure what is going to resolve the situation for them. So by asking these open-ended questions, you can actually kind of get them to formulate what it is that they're trying to have as an outcome of this situation and this interaction. It's a bit like dealing with hostage takers. People often think that when somebody takes somebody hostage, they have kind of like a plan and a defined outcome and some goals that they want. And often back in the 60s, when the original hostage negotiation units were being set up, that was what they were working to. Then when they went out in the field and they would ask the hostage taker, what is it that you want? The person would go, I don't know. And part of the process would be actually finding and trying to help that individual come up with what it was they wanted out of the situation. So we kind of use that open-ended question basis for finding out what the person wants, giving them a sense of empowerment and involvement in the process. And then we have some secondary stuff that we use. Should it be that what they're trying to get out of the situation is just something which isn't in the individual's power to grant or goes against company policy?
Yeah, it's a really good point. And the open-ended questions is, I think, is essential for establishing the. I'll just say, you need to establish whether de-escalation is even available to you.
Yes.
I mean, if someone is so agitated that they're so close to their crisis point that they're no longer able to engage in any sort of rational conversation, then no amount of de-escalation is going to work at that point.
Absolutely right.
Your priority has to shift to safety. So, and I think sometimes we get caught up, especially with traditional verbal de-escalation training or the shortcut verbal de-escalation training that's sometimes thrown out there, that people are told you always must de-escalate. And no, some situations are so far gone. The person's arrived already pre-triggered.
Yes.
They're right on the verge of exploding physically. You can't. It's negligent to then tell people to go and try and de-escalate that situation, especially if they're not skilled in crisis intervention. I mean, maybe someone like an Ellis Amda or you or I who might have a bit of experience dealing with people at that very high end, maybe we'd be able to pull it off. But even then, you'd be very high on guard, waiting for any indication that it's about to go the other way. So,
and I think, I think that's a really important point, because often de-escalation gets presented as this kind of like, solution that can work on everybody. The person kind of needs to want to be de-escalated. They need to want to find a solution that doesn't involve aggression and violence. And some people don't want that. Some people, let's say, coming into that shop, let's say to return a faulty good, have already written a script for themselves which sees them in conflict, and they're so tied up to that script that they're not even listening to what the person's saying or the alternatives that they might be offering. So I really do think that de-escalation is something that works when the person wants to seek alternatives, that wants to be de-escalated. If they don't, absolutely, you're now looking at, how do I make myself safe? How do I make my staff safe?
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's on a purely personal safety level. I mean, de-escalation has a place with social violence. So if it's something that someone has been upset by something you've done, or they're upset about a particular situation, and it's not a planned action, sure, you can de-escalate most of the time, as long as it's not too far gone. But if I said to you, how would you de-escalate a rapist? Well, that's not really a thing. I mean, it's a planned course of action where they've decided they're going to do this, and this is how it's going to be done. And all you can really do is just not present as the desired target at that point. But in the workplace point of view, de-escalation of someone who has already decided on a particular course of action is almost impossible, because, like you said, they know what they're trying to get, and they know what they're trying to do, and the approach to get them to not do that is not de-escalation. There's other strategies then that you can use, but de-escalation is off the table. But that question you ask, I think, is super important. When I teach verbal de-escalation, I call it the golden question, which is, what can I do to make this better for you?
Yeah.
And if you can't get a rational response to that, it doesn't mean it will be a pleasant response. It doesn't mean it'll be logical. It doesn't mean that it will necessarily be something that you can honor. But if they can't give you a rational answer to that question, then at that point you're like, you know what? If you can't tell me how I can make this better, then there's probably not a lot of point in having further conversation, because I'm not going to get there.
We talked about kind of 3 warning signs. Obviously, there are many, but 3 that we always teach is, and this is kind of the point of asking the question, because in asking the question, you get an idea where along the spectrum this individual is emotionally by how they respond to it. So we'll say, look, when you say, what can I do to sort this out? and you're met with silence, yeah, that's a person who's in another place. They're not looking to be de-escalated. If you're met with garbled words, so they start mixing up the order of their sentences, that person's getting ready to start to look to use aggression and violence as a means of resolving this conflict. And that's where I think sometimes conflict resolution is a weird term, because one way to resolve a conflict is through physical force and violence. Obviously, it's not the one we mean when we talk about conflict resolution. And the other one is something we refer to as repetitive looping, where the person just keeps repeating the same injustice over and over again. So they're not really moving the conversation forward. They're just stuck in that moment of repeating the complaint over and over again, often escalating it in terms of the volume that they use with the complaint and also the interval between each complaint. So they're kind of one of the things we say: if you ask a question and you're getting these three responses, you really need to start looking at making yourself safe.
Yeah, 100%. And I think actually this is probably a nice little segue into another part of the conversation. But we tend to fixate on with customer aggression. We tend to assume that it's always the customer's fault,
Right.
and it's not. I mean, people come in with legitimate grievances from time to time, and they're just not handled well.
Yes.
And one of the things that I sort of stress is you need to be able to read the situation and determine whether this person has a problem that can be solved, which is great. I mean, if they come in and they're actually looking for you to solve a problem,
Right.
sometimes people get too fixated on the behavior and they go, well, they're not behaving appropriately, therefore
Right.
I need to address the behavior, when just addressing the problem might have actually
Yes.
fixed it. Yeah. And you
Yes,
don't have to
definitely.
deal with this person for the next half an hour. You can actually get them out the door and they're happy and they're going to write you a positive review on Facebook.
Right.
Like that might be that might be achievable. But we sometimes get fixated on the behavior rather than thinking about, okay, what's their problem and how can I resolve it? Or we get fixated
I've
on what's
noticed this.
yeah.
I
So
was
you go.
just going to say that this is one of the common ones when dealing with operators who work by phone, who, I've worked for collection agencies, and I've also trained collection agencies. And one of the things that I think sometimes gets forgotten is when a collection agent rings up and says, "By the way, Mr. Jones, you owe $10,000," you are going to get an emotional response and reaction. You they're not going to meet it with a level-headed, "Oh, really? Is that how much I owe?" It's going to have an emotional response. And you sometimes see companies which have policies which turn around and say, look, as soon as a person starts to get emotional, you need to warn them and then tell them that you're going to hang up, because you shouldn't be spoken to in that way. And the problem is, if you warn somebody in that state, you're probably going to make them more emotional. So I think sometimes it's understanding, like you say, that the customer might have a genuine grievance, but they might also have kind of a genuine emotional response that reflects that grievance. And so I think sometimes when there's that zero tolerance, like you've started shouting, Mr. Jones, if you keep shouting, I'm going to have to hang up on you. We're actually going to escalate the situation where it might be necessary to let Mr. Jones have a bit of a rant for 30 seconds and actually get that emotion out of his system. Obviously, that's a little bit different because you've got a geographic separation. The conversation's happening over the phone. But I think sometimes we should recognize and expect that in response to something we say or do, there may well be a genuine emotional response, which doesn't necessarily indicate that the person is heading towards violence.
Yeah, and there's a difference between someone who wants you to solve a problem and someone who wants to be heard. And
Yes.
I think that's the other part. Sometimes we get fixated on solving the problem, but we're not actually acknowledging the emotion. So
Yes.
it's a double-edged sword. Sometimes you get too fixated on the emotion and you don't solve the problem. Other times you get too fixated on the problem and you don't acknowledge the emotion. And you end up with a situation. You mentioned the looping before.
Yeah.
Both parties are guilty of the looping, where you end up with
Yes.
a staff member who, yeah, they're in their own level of sympathetic nervous system
Right.
activation. They're starting to panic themselves. They're starting to lose a little bit of control of their faculties, and they start looping policy back at start to let's talk about return policy just as a really easy example. They start just repeating the policy over and over, and the customer is now saying, well, you're not even listening to me. You're just parroting something I could have read online, and they're going to get more and more frustrated. So sometimes it is about the emotion, sometimes it's about the problem, and it's up to us to be able to diagnose that.
And I think it's a lot to ask, like we're saying, somebody who undergoes 1 day of training and is on minimum wage to actually, correctly deal with these incidents. I always say whatever level of security you're at, it's one of the hardest jobs in the world because you're dealing with people. And again, I think, training should be given in these things, or there should be people who are skilled in this. So, again, going back to that returns policy, if you have a returns desk, it should be somebody who knows actually how to handle these people. You shouldn't be putting on the junior, this is their second day, and it just happens to be the day after Christmas. That would be a very inappropriate allocation of resources.
And yet it happens so frequently, doesn't it?
Unfortunately, it does, because at that time of year, people are on holiday, you're having temporary staff in, and all of those things. And that's why I think, again, going back to that life cycle and timing of events within businesses, you should really be training your Christmas staff sometime in August, as opposed to, the first week in December. And again, a lot of times the staff don't understand and know what power they have in terms of, say, issuing a return, which is why you see the majority of assaults by customers on employees, that it's managers and supervisors, because the individual who first started dealing with a complaint passes it up the line. And the problem with that is, as the person realizes they're talking now, say, to the manager, and there's no further recourse for them to go, suddenly now it becomes this very make or break moment, that if they're not able to convince the manager that this return should be accepted, really now they're into a letter writing stage, and that ability to make that return goes. So again, you can often see those sort of crisis moments come as the junior member quickly passes it on to the manager, and the person suddenly realize, this is it. If I don't convince this person of my complaint and don't get them to accept this return, it's not going to happen.
Yeah, there's some maybe we can actually talk a little bit about some general advice for dealing with those sort of situations. But one situation I had recently, and I always find it amusing when I get agitated about service, because I teach customer service. Yeah, and I teach people how to give good service, and I teach them how to manage aggression. So when I find myself getting agitated and aggressive about service, I it's kind of like one of those sort of self-realization moments that you're still a monkey. But yes. I remember I was on a late night flight heading back home after, I don't even know what, doing some sort of business. And I was on a budget airline, Jetstar, for any Australians that are listening. But I was on Jetstar, and I was at the gate. I had carry-on only luggage. And our luggage system works a little bit different here than it does in the US. But I had carry-on only luggage. I was ready to board, and they pulled us aside, and they wanted to weigh all the carry-on. Right. And we're just about to board. So if your carry-on is too heavy, you don't really have many options. You can't run back and check it. It's not going to happen.
Right.
So my carry-on was 1.5 kilos, so 3 pounds too heavy past the limit, right? So I'd flown into the city on a different airline that had a 14 kilo limit for carry-on, and I was flowing on a different airline which had a 7 kilo limit. So I queried that, and considering the airlines are actually owned by the same company, I queried that. I'm like, well, why is Qantas allowed me to have 14 kilos and carry on, and you only allow me to have 7? And she said, it's about safety. I said, do Qantas employ stronger staff? Like, what's the issue? why is there such a dramatic difference? She goes, no, it's definitely about safety.
Right.
And I said, well, so what's it going to cost me for this extra 1.5 kilos? And she said, it's going to cost $70. I was like, $70 for like, and I don't have any options. There's nothing in my bag
Yes.
that, other
Well,
than
they
surrendering
know
my
you
laptop.
haven't got any options.
Exactly. So I know, look, I know 100% that it's about revenue. It's about trapping me there so that I end up giving them money, which I did because I didn't have any other options.
Yep.
But the fact that she insisted it was about safety actually irritated me further because I was like, I know it's not about safety because you've got the exact same staff working on the other airline who who are saying that it's okay for this thing to be twice as heavy as it is. So the learning from that, other than the first learning for me was get back in your box. You're taking out anger on someone who's just repeating a script they've been told to say.
Yeah.
But the other thing is, don't make shit up. I mean, if you don't tell someone it's about safety, but considering I'm an OH&S consultant, so I know full well it's not about safety. And it actually irritated me more that I felt like I was being lied to as well as extorted for money. So
it's an indefensible position. And that I think is a danger.
I'd rather, I'd actually rather her say, look, I'm not sure, but it is our policy. Because then I wouldn't have been angry at her because she wouldn't have been lying to me.
Right.
And obviously she was just going through the script she's been told, it's about safety because then no one argues with you, except if they know then it's not about safety and they're trying to figure out what the actual issue is, or at least get you to admit that you're just trying to extort money from me because you can.
And I think that's the problem. It's like if you're sending your employees out to bat with a position which is indefensible, which somebody could pick apart, you kind of are putting them at risk. Where, there are one of the things, that I've often sort of seen people use is it's about insurance. And when you say it's about insurance is such a complex game that you kind of can't argue. So if it was a case of like, I'm very sorry, but, we're not insured for objects greater than 7 kilograms, that you can't argue with. We're acknowledging that it's a monetary thing, which hopefully you're also acknowledging by flying on a budget airline, that I would expect them maybe a lower level of insurance on something such as luggage, not on safety overall.
I'm gonna go out there and blame Gav, if you're listening. That's Gav's policy that I have to fly budget. Just saying. So I might actually edit that out, but just because we both know him, I thought I'd throw it out there. Absolutely. I think you throw people out there with, like I said, an indefensible position, and they just keep. Especially, I mean, I could tell once I started. I mean, I wasn't aggressive about the arguing, but I could probably, she no doubt knew that I was not pleased about it. But granted, she was going to have that conversation with another 20 or 30 people on that flight. Right. That it's 9:00 at night. Everyone wants to get home. They want it to be over with. And now you're going to tell me that I have to pay you extra money as well. Yes. She was in a really bad spot. She was going to deal with continual conflict over and over, and there actually was a guy that ended up being arrested on the flight, and that all started with that particular interaction because he had to pay extra for his luggage. And when he got on the plane, he was then agitated and started picking a fight with someone else who had a really large bag that he didn't think had been charged extra. And then it ended up escalating where he got talked down to by a flight attendant. This is actually a really good case study because the mother hen flight attendant came over and put a finger in his face and told him to behave himself. Right. And then it just went further and further. And I started thinking I was going to end up landing in a different airport so we could get dragged off the plane. But thankfully, we made it back to Melbourne before they arrested him, which was at least good for the rest of us. But anyway, but I think, like I said, throwing people out there with a script that's faulty just sets them up for panic. And the staff member I was dealing with, I could tell on her face she started to panic because she didn't have anywhere else to go. Right. She didn't have another option to start explaining to me, and she wasn't able to think on her feet and explain it. And then thankfully I was able to realize, you're being a bit of a dick. Just calm. And I was able to disengage. But it's a tough situation for her to be in.
The company holds a great deal of responsibility because somewhere along the line that they've taken a decision that they're going to charge people like the $70 fee for overweight luggage, knowing that it's going to make people more aggressive and angry and putting the staff in a difficult position. But they've decided in the revenue model that that's kind of a risk that they're willing to take. And And I think that's where, without going into sort of you know, the facelessness of big business. But I think there's often cases where it's easier, it's cheaper to just send somebody out there with a terrible script than actually train them properly how to deal with them, or to try and find a more equitable means of charging for overweight luggage.
Yeah, and you're right. I mean, it always comes down to dollars and cents, and it is interesting from a risk management point of view that the revenue that obviously comes in from those sort of charges must be greater than the insurance cost of having staff assaulted or stress leave. How well that's calculated is hard to say, but it actually opens up another door of conversation. One of the things that I've found here, and I know it's echoed in the UK, and I assume probably in the US as well, is a reluctance to train staff to deal with aggression in the fear that they'll deal with it wrong, or they'll use the skills incorrectly and create greater liability issues. So it's almost like it's cheaper. So, for example, healthcare, we'll just go back to healthcare because it is an industry that gets a lot of attention from aggression management point of view. Some organizations don't provide any physical self-defense training whatsoever, even for staff in high-risk areas like emergency departments or mental health or whatever, because it's actually cheaper for them to pay the work cover or the insurance on an injury than it is to pay for the potential injury of them getting hurt in the training, or the potential PR issue of a badly executed restraint, or a patient being injured and the lawsuit that comes after that. It's almost like the Fight Club scenario from the very start of the movie, with the cost of the recall is greater than the cost of the settlement of the lawsuit, then the vehicle doesn't get recalled. And that's something that can be frustrating when you look at it simplistically, black and white. Should people be trained to deal with aggression, yes or no? But it all comes down to dollars and cents, and we're talking about workplace violence. We have to consider that this has to be financially viable.
I think there's a step that even goes before that. I think that's absolutely spot on as a piece of analysis. One of the things we found with certain industries and certain companies within certain industries is there's a reluctance to actually admit there's a problem, or there's a potential for a problem, for fear that this opens a door up. So that if you offer training to somebody to say, like, okay, we recognize that, customers on Black Friday, are likely, or there's a good likelihood to get physically aggressive and violent with one of the staff members. If we acknowledge that, there's a sort of feeling that the company is deliberately putting this person at risk, rather than sort of turning around and going like, yes, we recognize that certain jobs, occupations, certain industries have higher risks than others, and therefore training should be provided to mitigate those risks. But one of the things we run up here is a lot of that kind of denial that there is the potential for a problem, because by sort of acknowledging it, you're opening up the potential gate for a lawsuit should something happen.
Yeah, and to be honest, the research proposal, the research project that I mentioned earlier, one of the goals for that is to establish that this is the reality, and have this backed by industry and by academic, a strong academic position that this is the current state of affairs. You can no longer plead ignorance about this.
Yes.
And that's part of what we're doing. I mean, some organizations are more progressive than others, but if we can have a objective analysis to say, okay, you know what, you can't, that card's now off the table. You can't plead ignorance because this has been established, and this is what best practice looks like. You're aware of what best practice looks like. You're either going to comply or not. And I think that's unfortunately we're at a point where we have to do that to try and help people. But for sure, I think acknowledging the problem is sometimes it's sometimes harder than it seems, because even if they're aware of the problem, publicly acknowledging it's a different thing, especially in the age of litigation. So, yeah, very interesting, mate. So just to progress the conversation, because I know you've got to teach classes in the nearish future. So let's talk a little bit about higher end aggression. So we've talked a little bit about verbal and sort of spontaneous aggression over dissatisfied service and so on. Let's talk about the customer who has a grudge and is coming back. Let's just dive in right into the active armed offender or active
Yeah,
shooter, or it doesn't have to be a firearm. It could be someone
right.
who comes back with a weapon of any sort.
Yes.
In Australia, I don't know if it's hit the international media yet. We just had a attempted mass stabbing in Sydney yesterday.
Yes, I saw that.
Yeah, which is look, a fascinating case study in improvised weapons. I don't know if you've seen the video, but
No.
the the offender, who is currently trying to ascertain whether it was a terror-related incident or not, but the offender stabbed two women, and then a group of about 6 to 8 men started chasing him, and they chased him through the city. And somehow or other, there was a news camera there that was also chasing him, which was convenient. I mean, someone witnessed that they saw a guy with a news camera on his shoulder running down the street after a guy holding a knife, and they thought they were filming a TV show.
Right.
but there happened to be a fire crew that gave chase, and there's a guy chasing him with an axe in his hand because he's grabbed an axe.
Yeah,
off.
there we go.
And and then the group end up catching up with him, and there's some great footage. I mean, I don't want to glorify this, because obviously a lady lost her life, and there's another one who's been seriously injured, but he's pinned down under outdoor furniture. So they've grabbed cafe furniture and put the chairs on top of him, and sat on top of the chairs, and someone's got a milk crate and put on top of his head, and they're standing on the milk crate, and he's well and truly restrained with outdoor furniture and weapons of opportunity, which as a fellow Krav Maga instructor, that makes my heart warm. Firstly, that people acted and chased him, and he was, I mean, you can hear in the video he's saying, "Shoot me, shoot me, shoot me."
Yeah.
He was attempting to get suicide by cop. And the only reason he wasn't killed is that the bystanders got there before the police did, and none of the bystanders carry a weapon here. So,
and again, that's a characteristic of many mass killings, that suicidal ideation. And I think there's so many things that come out of stories like that, how if people work as a team together, kind of spirits, as it were, get buoyed, and there's more confidence. The ability that we have to improvise and use tools. There's so much that comes out of that. But I think it also shows that, when the many as one solutions start to get implemented, you actually start to see successes in these situations. And success might be judged by a limited number of fatalities, not necessarily a complete elimination, but how many more people would have been stabbed and killed had not that group kind of put pressure on him and gave chase.
Yeah, and actually, something else I found interesting was that he was screaming, "Shoot me, shoot me, shoot me!" So, if the police had been there, I would say 90% sure that he would have rushed them with a knife to get shot.
Yes.
There was a guy. There was a a firefighter standing there with an axe in his hand, and he didn't rush the guy with the axe. So I think the idea of being shot to death was a little bit more attractive than being hacked to death with an axe. So once he saw the axe, he actually took off. So
right.
There's an interesting piece of psychology there that I think he was quite happy to be shot, but not so much to be killed with an axe.
Well,
so,
one theoretically is over in an instant, and the other one is kind of a continued sort of assault on you.
Yeah, it certainly reconnected him back with his will to live, I think.
Yes.
So, sorry, I don't want to make light of that situation because it is very fresh, but it was one of the observations that I had was that, maybe the police need to be carrying axes instead of firearms. I don't know.
Right.
But, so look, let's talk about active shooter preparedness just briefly. What you offer in terms of training and advice for organizations that are trying to be prepared for the possibility of an active shooter situation?
I think a lot of the emphasis we put on is that preparation and prevention. Oftentimes, these individuals will actually start with a letter writing campaign, an email campaign, some form of drawing attention to the injustice that they've feel that's been meted out to them by the organization. So there's often somewhere along the lines some communication of violent intent before the violent intent actually occurs. Obviously, you do get sort of as it were, the person who returns to the car after a heated exchange comes back with their firearm and basically starts a spree. But you'll often find that there's a much longer history to that. That this is just the tipping point, the incident which is a triggering event. So normally, when you have these sort of like campaigns against, I don't know, a Walmart or something like that, that there are warning signs out there. There are normally some sort of threats have been made, but often they're not taken seriously. There's one company that we work for, which obviously I'm not going to mention their name due to non-disclosure agreements. But they hire a lot of temporary workers when they're building warehouses, and then they have to let them go. And they often receive a large number, obviously these are employees, of kind of email campaigns sort of stating injustices and what the company needs to do to make it right. And you'll often find with customers of retailers who've felt there's been injustice against them will engage in these types of campaigns. So part of the training is to teach management to recognize when these are serious or when they're kind of hollow. And I don't mean that necessarily on the first one, you sort of put it in the not to be taken seriously bin. But it's sometimes trying at the very early stages to identify if there is a customer out there who has harmful intent against the organization. So that's really the first step that we do. When you're dealing with somebody actually coming into the workplace which is open to the public, such as a retail outlet, now it gets very difficult. It's actually, I would say, more difficult than in office environments, which tend to be more densely populated with employees who you can potentially train. In a retail situation, you might have, let's say, 20 staff members who have undergone such training on how to physically deal with a shooter or a killer, but find that they're sort of like sparsely populated throughout a large sort of footage of a retail space. So a lot of it will determine, like when we're dealing with restaurants, for example, we have to teach slightly different solutions to when we're dealing with those sort of large retail outlets. I'm not sure if that fully answers your question or whether you want to kind of delve deeper in and sort of direct it somewhere.
Yeah, no, that's really valid. It's managing an incident like that is so difficult when you have such a high percentage of people around you being untrained and panicking, and
yes,
I mean a lot of active shooter training, quite rightly based on the statistics, is essentially for an office-based environment where everybody there has had the basic training, or at least the high percentage have had the basic training. So everyone's going to act in a way that you hopefully will act in a way that they've been trained to do so. But when you start throwing in a public place where you now have a couple of thousand of members of the public who are all going to act in different ways, who have had no training whatsoever, and you're trying to keep them safe and your staff safe and try to resolve the issue and try to alert law enforcement and try to coordinate an evacuation or a lockdown, that's incredibly difficult. Actually, just recently I was fortunate enough to be at an industry breakfast talking about the Christchurch massacre.
Yes.
And they had a young girl. Sorry, I shouldn't say young girl. They had a lady there who was the center manager for a large shopping center, which was 700 meters away from where the massacre took place.
Yep.
And this is the largest public gathering space in Christchurch. So her shopping center is full, and they're receiving word that there is an active shooter on the loose, very close by. And this is New Zealand. This isn't a daily occurrence. In fact, obviously there's never been one like that in New Zealand previously. So, and she is a 20-something-year-old retail center manager, and she's trying to coordinate. How do I get all these shops to close? What do we do? Do we evacuate? Do we lock down? Do we? How do I manage all my staff? How do I manage all the customers? And they're getting, obviously law enforcement are scrambling to figure out what's happening as well. So the first message they get is evacuate. they start trying to do an evacuation, and then halfway through the evacuation, they get another call saying, no, lockdown,
Right.
bring everyone back in and lock everyone inside. And then halfway through that, they get another call saying, no, you need to evacuate. So the chaos that
Oh,
causes, and then, of course, every single staff member and every person who, yeah, as soon as the sirens start going off and there's a moment, people will grab their phones and jump on social media.
yeah.
And I remember watching this live. The initial reports were there were multiple shooters in multiple locations. There was car bombs. There was all this stuff that was coming out on social media and even some news sites that indicated that this was a much more like a Bataclan theater type situation where you actually had multiple crime scenes, and it wasn't the case. But that was the perception at the time. That was the information that's coming out, especially on social media. So you are now getting messaging that's not controlled by the authorities, that's not verified or validated, and people reacting to the information they're seeing on their Facebook feed as opposed to the instructions of the people who are actually trying to coordinate the evacuation or the lockdown. So it really, really interesting to hear her take on how they managed that. And what it actually came down to for them, their key learning out of that was just communication, was having more centralized communication.
I think it's also recognizing, and this is part of the confusion, that often active shooter instances get kind of elevated to terrorist instances. So when we teach active shooter, we teach that there are three basic assumptions that you work to. And again, these are assumptions, so there will be occasions where they're wrong. But in around 99.9% of cases, they are safe assumptions to make. One of them is that the shooter is acting alone. If you actually look for the statistics of active shooter instances, most of the time the shooter is alone. And this is a good assumption to kind of work from, because if you have knowledge of where the shooter is, then that can determine now your evacuation policy or your lockdown policy. Which one am I going to implement? We also teach that the shooter hasn't altered the environment, which is again something that often gets always reported on at the time and blown out, that they've set bombs here, they've set bombs there. That's not really your standard active shooter incident. And the other one we teach, which is, and this is more practically when you're actually dealing with them, is that the active shooter has multiple weapons. So although weapon disarming is nice from a technical point of view, you're better off trying to shut the shooter down, i.e. I'm not necessarily saying kill them, but render them unconscious or physically disable them so they're no longer able to continue the spree. I think a lot of the communication confusion comes around when people sort of move away from those assumptions and start adding in unsubstantiated pieces of information, like he set up a car bomb at the end of the road. That's not standard in an active shooter situation. And I know it can be hard to determine what's actually happening in the moment, but I think a lot of the time we overcomplicate what are basically very simple situations by sort of imagining too much and reading insignificant details to be highly significant. And so I think if we always have, like in an active shooter instance, some very basic assumptions to work to and filter information through those assumptions, we can come up with a much more actionable, definable plan.
Yeah, absolutely, mate. All right, I'm very conscious of your time because I know you're on a tight schedule, so we might leave it there, mate. Just for anyone who wants to know more about you, where can they go to buy your books, read your blog, book you for talking, consulting, all the crazy stuff you do? Where can I send them?
So they can read my blog at kravmagablog.com. So just as it reads, kravmagablog.com. I have a personal website. There's not a lot of information on, but it's a good way to get in contact with me, which is gershonbenkeren.com. So all kind of simple. And again, most of our services are listed at bostonkravmaga.com.
Excellent. Thank you very much for your time, mate. It's always a pleasure to talk. And
great to talk to you, Joe.
Yeah, we can no doubt do it again in the future. Again, it's always a pleasure to collaborate with you, and I will be getting your input as well on this research, because I think it'll be great to pick your brain about it as well. Mate, thank you again, and I hope you go and enjoy teaching your classes, and we'll talk to you again next time.
Talk to you soon. Take care, Joe.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye. It's always a ton of fun talking to Gershon Ben Keren, my brother from another mother via Scotland and Boston. I had a great time talking to him. I hope you guys enjoyed listening to it. And just a reminder, head on over to patreon.com/managingviolence if you'd like to chip in and support the show. And also leave us a review on iTunes. If you leave us a 5-star review and write a few words, send me a screenshot of your review to joe@joesaunders.com.au and I'll send you a free PDF first version of Bouncer Stories, my first book. That will be free. All you got to do is leave us a review. That's it for this week. As our great friend of the show, Professor Matt Larson, says, always be the warrior in the room. Talk to you next time. Thank you for listening to the Managing Violence podcast. For more information, to view previous episodes, or to read blogs, articles, and so much more, please check out my website at www.joesaunders.com.au. www.joesaunders.com.au. Thank you. Talk to you next time.